Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on any newly released content. Also, I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a comment of any cases that you'd like to hear me cover and any improvements I can make on this channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Bardstown, Kentucky, a small town located in central Kentucky with a population of around 13,000. It's located about 40 miles south of Kentucky's largest city, Louisville. Bardstown is known as the bourbon capital of the world, given its many distilleries within close proximity. And in 2012, it was also named the most beautiful small town in America. But a string of unsolved murders have left the townspeople shaken up and on edge. This case is a very bizarre one. There's a lot of twists and unexpected events that are sought to tie into the disappearance of Crystal Rogers, including shady dealings, corrupt police officers, and ties to other crimes and local unsolved cases. This is a lengthy video, so bear with me, but I have spent a lot of time doing some extensive research to bring you all of the details. Crystal Maria Ballard Rogers was born on April the 4th of 1980 in Bardstown, Kentucky, to Sherry and Tommy Ballard. She is the eldest of her siblings, a brother Casey and a sister Brooke. Tommy and Sherry raised all three of their children in Bardstown. Crystal is described as a great mother to her five children, who in 2015 ranged from 2 years old up to 16 years old. She is also described as being very kind, funny, laid back, a little quiet and shy, and very hardworking. Crystal became a mom at the young age of just 19, but she loved being a mother. She worked various jobs to support her children, and sometimes multiple jobs at once. From waiting tables to tending convenience stores, she did whatever necessary to provide for them. She had a lot of support from her parents as well, in which she had always remained very close with. Crystal married Keith Rogers, and together they had two children. Sometime later, though, they separated, though they never legally divorced. She moved out of the home she shared with Keith, and she and her then four children moved into a rental home owned by a man named Brooks Houck. Brooks William Houck was born on October the 12th of 1981 in Bardstown, where he was raised. He loved his hometown of Bardstown, in which he took pride in. In 2012, Brooks Houck ran for sheriff of Nelson County, citing in his campaign ads that it was time for the office to have new blood and fresh ideas. However, he lost the campaign. Unlike his younger brother Nick Houck, Brooke had no prior police experience when he ran for sheriff. Instead, the 34-year-old businessman had built a good career for himself in real estate and in construction work. He had three businesses enlisted in his name: Houck Rentals, LLC, Select Quality Homes, LLC, and Central Kentucky Real Estate Rentals, LLC. These three entities have 139 registered properties with the PVA in Nelson County, Kentucky, with the majority of them being rental properties. Brooks's construction company had built a lot of these homes. He had several employees who worked for him in his construction business and in his rental properties maintenance. He was respected, wealthy, and the Houck name itself was prominent in the community, and he was very prideful of his family's last name and image. Brooks had asked Crystal on a date several times since she had moved into his rental property before she finally agreed and took him up on it. They began dating very soon after, and she and her four children moved into Brooks's home with him located at 113 Glenview Drive in Bardstown. In October of 2013, Crystal and Brooks welcomed a son named Eli. This was Brooks's first and only child, and Crystal's fifth and youngest child. Crystal earned some money babysitting part-time, but primarily she was helping Brooks with the rental properties. Sherry and Tommy Ballard welcomed Brooks into the family with open arms. He seemed like a good match for their daughter, and they took him in as if he was family of their own. But that was short lived when they soon after discovered how differently he treated the children. Sherry admits that Brooks was a good father to Eli, but Crystal's other four children were almost non existent to him. Brooks financially provided anything and everything Eli needed, but Crystal was solely financially responsible to provide everything for her other four children. Even groceries were divided. Brooks brought groceries into the home for his son, but Crystal was responsible to pay for any food her other four children consumed. Crystal's family soon began to realize how controlling Brooks was and how the relationship had suddenly turned toxic. Sherry wanted Crystal to break it off with Brooks. However, Crystal stayed to try to straighten the relationship out and keep her family together. But things seemed to only get worse instead of better. Family to Brooks was different from family to Crystal. For him, it just meant he, Crystal, and Eli. Eventually, Crystal had had enough, and she'd been talking about wanting to leave Brooks for some time, but fear held her back. Brooks's wealth gave him some power, and she feared that he would seek and be granted custody of Eli if she left. Eventually, things had gotten so bad, though, and they were fighting a lot. Crystal allegedly told a friend that she had a manila envelope put up with some information in it in case something were to ever happen to her. Sherry says that when she seen her daughter on July the 2nd of 2015, Crystal confided in her about Brooks renting his properties for cash to evade taxes and that he had lied to her about paying his taxes. Sherry says that Crystal told her, "Mom, he thinks I'm an idiot, but I have everything. I have all of his rentals, I have all of his tax papers, I have everything, and I hid that." It's one of the biggest regrets Sherry says she still carries today, not asking her daughter where she hid that proof at, as that was the last time she would ever see her daughter. On July the 3rd of 2015, a witness saw Crystal's 2007 maroon Chevy Impala pull into the driveway of her home on Glenview Drive around 5 p.m. and saw Crystal carrying in some bags. Brooks returned home from work for the day about 30 minutes later, and he says that Crystal and Eli got into his vehicle with him to go to the Houcks family farm. Crystal's older daughter Ashley was supposed to go to the farm with them that evening, but she stayed behind at home instead, awaiting her paternal grandmother to come and pick her up. The Houck farm was located at 345 Paschal Ballard Lane, out of city limits. It was about a 15 or 20-minute drive from their home on Glenview Drive to the farm. The Houck family farm is about a 250-acre farm with three large pasture fields, a pond, a barn, and a farmhouse on it, in which Brooks' mother, Rosemary Houck, lives. Brooks claims the farm has been in the family since his grandfather purchased it back in the 60s. His grandfather and many of his siblings have since passed on, and Brooks purchased the farm from the remaining family members. Sherry says that in the later evening of July the 3rd, she received a text from Crystal's then 14-year-old daughter, Kylie, asking if she had heard from her mom. Sherry says she then texted Crystal's phone and told her, "You need to text Kylie, she's looking for you." She says she didn't get a response from Crystal either, and at that moment she didn't really think nothing of it, until later the same night when Sherry received another text from Kylie asking again if she had heard from her mother yet. Sherry says she replied back to Kylie saying no, she never texted you, and Kylie replied no. This was when Sherry began to feel like something was wrong. Family and friends tried calling and texting Crystal's phone for the next 2 days, but no one could reach her. Her parents even called around to others to see if anyone had seen or talked to Crystal, but no one had been able to get into contact with her. On Sunday, July the 5th, Crystal's sister Brooke calls her mother to also tell her that she's not been able to get a hold of Crystal either. Brooke also tells her mother that she's even called Brooks' house phone to try to reach Crystal, but Brooks told her that he hadn't seen or heard from her since Friday, July the 3rd either. Brooks claims that when they visited the farm on Friday night, they fed the cows and chickens and lit a bonfire and hung out all night walking all over the farm. He says they left the farm around midnight and drove back home. He says that he went straight to bed when he got home, while Crystal stayed up playing games on her phone and Eli stayed up with her. He says he awoke the following morning to see Eli in the bed with him, but Crystal was gone. Brooks says he didn't try to call Crystal's phone. He didn't want to bother her. And he really wasn't worried because he says she's gone off and stayed at her cousin Sabrina's house many times before, and he assumed that she had gone there to spend the 4th of July holiday with her. He says he left out of the house with Eli that next morning on July the 4th and spent several hours at the Houck family farm. He says he used his bulldozer to fix an area in front of the barn where water builds up when it rains, while Eli played on his tricycles and with the chickens. Later that evening, he says he attended a 4th of July family gathering at his Uncle Fabian's house. He and Eli had rode over to his uncle's house with his mother, Rosemary. Brooks says that there was a lot of family members there, and they ate dinner and left just before dark before they had begun setting off fireworks. Sunday, July the 5th, around 12 p.m., Brooks and Eli pulled into a Murphy's gas station off Highway 49, Loretto Road, which is the road traveled to get to and from the family farm. Sherry and one of Crystal's daughters just so happened to be at the gas station at the same time as well. When Sherry noticed Brooks's truck, she ran over to the window and she asked Brooks, "Well, what happened? Did y'all have a fight or something?" But Brooks told her no, they hadn't been fighting. Sherry then noticed her 2-year-old grandson in the back seat, and her heart dropped. Eli was rarely with Brooks. Crystal always had him. She became anxious and told Brooks that maybe they needed to go file a missing persons report. And Brooks replies saying, "Yeah, that's what you should do." Around 3 p.m. that evening of July the 5th, Sherry, Tommy, and Crystal's brother Casey go to the Bardstown police office and file a missing persons report. The Ballards were very concerned. They knew their daughter better than anyone, and they kept telling police that Crystal would never just take off and not answer anyone or abandon her children. But the police were not so sure just yet that the 35-year-old mother hadn't taken off on her own wheel somewhere to maybe catch a break and have some time to herself. While at the police station, however, the Ballards receive a phone call from Crystal's ex-husband's son, who told them that a car that looked to be like Crystal's was sitting on the side of Bluegrass Parkway at mile marker 14 with a flat tire. Tommy and Casey immediately rushed over to the location, arriving around 5 p.m. that evening. And sure enough, Crystal's 2007 maroon Chevy Impala was abandoned on the side of the road with a flat tire, the keys still in the ignition, and her purse and cell phone laying in the passenger seat. They also noticed that, oddly enough, the driver's seat had been pushed further back and the seat positioned straight up. Sherry and Tommy say that Crystal always drove closer to the steering wheel and with her seat slightly reclined. They knew at first glance of the positioning of the seat that someone else had been driving her vehicle. This discovery was like deja vu all over again for the Ballard family, though they prayed that this time the outcome would be different. You see, this isn't the first missing persons case within the Ballard family. On January the 19th of 1979, Tommy's 19-year-old sister, Freda Shireen Ballard, or Sherry as she was called, which is a shortened version of her middle name, went missing in Bardstown. She had married a man named Edsel Barnes, or Eddie as everyone called him, and the couple soon after found out that they would be parents as Sherry was pregnant. But the marriage was already rocky, and the pregnancy only made the tension worse. That evening, on January the 19th, Sherry, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, left her parents' home and headed to a mechanic shop to have her car looked at. But instead she disappeared. Police in the community of Bardstown performed many search efforts, and finally, about 2 months later, near her due date, Sherry's purse was found on a bank of a wooded area next to the Ohio River in Clarksville, Indiana.
Searchers walked just a little further up along the river bank and discovered the back end of her car sticking up out of the river. But Sherry Barnes was still missing. A rock had been placed on top of the gas pedal, perhaps to have the car drive into the river itself without having a driver inside of the car. The whole community of Bardstown suspected her husband Eddie was involved. However, the case lacked evidence and a body, just like Crystal's case. Sherry Barnes would continue to be a missing person for the next 3 years until her remains were finally discovered in 1982. Tommy Ballard was 20 years old at that time. Sherry had been shot and her body buried on a farm in Nelson County, close to the same area where her niece, Crystal Rogers' car would be found abandoned 33 years later in 2015. Her husband Eddie Barnes and a friend of Eddie's, George Weir, were both charged with one count of first-degree murder. Eddie Barnes killed his wife because he wasn't ready to be a father and he didn't want to pay child support or a big hospital bill for the delivery. The state tried to bring two charges of first-degree murder against the two men, but ultimately the courts ruled that an unborn child could not be ruled a murder victim. Both men were found guilty of first-degree murder in 1984 and given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In 2004, Kentucky state legislators honored Sherry Barnes and her unborn child in passing the Sherry Ballard Fetal Homicide Act, which added a double murder charge for the murder of a pregnant woman. The actual name of the law would, however, later be changed. Allegedly, Brooks Houck had inquired about the murder of her aunt on several occasions by asking Crystal many details. Upon confirming the abandoned car to be Crystal's, the Ballards called police out to the scene, who arrived with bloodhounds. They searched in and around the vehicle and ran the bloodhounds all around the location, but the dogs never hit on anything, not even in or around her very own car. "It's as if she had not even been here," said lead detective of the case, John Snow. Police seized the car for further investigation, and news of the missing 35-year-old mother appeared across several media outlets that same night. Police also held a press conference to confirm that Crystal Rogers was a missing person and detailed information on finding her abandoned car. They pleaded for the community to come forward with any information or tips. Police got in contact with Brooks, and he came into the police station to give a statement. He told them that after a late night at the family farm, he, Eli, and Crystal arrived back home just after midnight, and he went straight to bed while she stayed up playing games on her phone. The next morning when he woke up, he says Crystal was gone. Police also took the bloodhounds out to the area around the farm, and Detective John Snow says the dogs tracked Crystal's scent from inside of the truck that she rode in for a good ways down Highway 49 up to the entrance driveway of the farm. "As if they were following right behind your truck," Detective John Snow said to Brooks Houck. But those same dogs didn't hit on anything at the scene of her very own vehicle. Subsequently, Crystal's vehicle was further searched at a crime lab, and investigators pulled two suspicious hairs from the vehicle using a tape pulling method. Those hairs were stored in evidence to later be tested for a DNA profile. The appearance of the two hairs, which were found on the driver's seat and in the floorboard, do not appear to be a match to Crystal's hair, as they are much shorter in length and different in color. Other evidence was collected and stored to review during the investigation. On July the 6th of 2015, the Ballard family hired a private investigator. The family also posted a reward for information leading to Roger's discovery in the amount of $25,000. The community came together to help search for Crystal. Signs were put out all across Bardstown from one end to the other, and billboards of the missing mother's face went up. While police did their own investigative work, the Ballards, and Tommy Ballard in particular, did his own work. The community came together to help in search efforts of Crystal on several occasions, But one person, however, who didn't seem to have any interest in helping look for Crystal was her boyfriend and father of her youngest child, Brooks Howe. Crystal's family was suspicious of Brooks from the very beginning, and they were vocal about it. Sherry even says that she ran into Brooks again after Crystal vanished, and she told him, "I think you did something to my daughter, and I made that very clear," she says. On July the 8th, 2015, Brooks Houck was brought into the Nelson County Sheriff's Office for an interview with Detective John Snow. At this point, this was the third time that the detective had met and briefly talked with Brooks, and during one of those prior encounters, police had seized his phone, so on this day when he went into the office for his first official interview, he did not have his phone with him, and the police still had it. Brooks also had been given a polygraph at some point before this interview, and the results were inconclusive. The detective first tells Brooks that there's been some talk of some possible tax evasion or tax fraud, to which Brooks tells him no and gives him all the information to his tax preparer and tells him that he can obtain all the records he needs from him. The detective then tells Brooks that he wants to go over the timeline again because something is off. Fortunately for police, they were able to find multiple sources of video surveillance along the route of Highway 49, Loretto Road, which led to the farm. And even better, a neighboring property had a camera that picked up footage of the Houck family farm's driveway. Brooks and detectives go over the timeline once again. The detective asks what they had been doing during all the time on the farm that night, and Brooks kind of struggles to fill in enough details adequate enough for the several hours he was there. But he says that they fed the cows and chickens and walked to the back of the 250-acre farm. The detective says that a witness had came forward reporting a fire on the grounds of the farm the night that Crystal went missing. Brooks then adds in that yes, he lit a bonfire and they kind of hung out around the farm until it went out. According to a neighboring property surveillance, they were able to determine that Brooks's truck left out of the farm around 11:45 p.m. that night. The detective tells Brooks that his phone records reveal a call came in right at about midnight, in which Brooks had a 13-second conversation with the caller. He asked Brooks who called him and what that 13-second conversation was about, but Brooks says he's not sure and tells the detective that they'll just have to call the number back and check into it. He also asked Brooks about another call that showed on his records to have came in around 7 o'clock the next morning on July the 4th. Again, Brooks doesn't remember. He asked Brooks if he and Crystal had gotten into a fight or argument on July the 3rd, and Brooks tells him no, that everything was just fine. Detective Snow then asked Brooks why he hadn't called Crystal's phone once he awoke and seen that she was gone. Brooks says he did try to call her later on in the day, but he says that he really wasn't alarmed anyway because Crystal and her sister Brooke and Sabrina take off and party a lot, leaving him with Eli and sometimes all of their kids too. Of course, this wasn't true and it sounded really bogus anyway coming out of his mouth. Brooks was controlling. He wouldn't allow that to happen. His ego was big. He would not stand for the embarrassment of having a girlfriend running around on him. Knowing that tale sounded unbelievable, he then goes on to say that Crystal has always been known to take off and stay at her cousin Sabrina's house when they've had fights or disagreements, and sometimes she'll stay for a couple days, so he really wasn't concerned. However, he must have forgotten that he had just told the detective earlier in the interview that they were not arguing or fighting at all that night of July the 3rd when she vanished. And police would later speak with Sabrina, who told them that in the past 3 or so years that Crystal had only came over when she was upset or they'd gotten into a fight maybe twice, but never to sleep over at her house. So this wasn't a common thing at all as Brooks alleged. And at one point during the interview, Brooks breaks down and has a little pity party for himself, saying that he's the victim, he's the one being affected, and he's totally innocent, and now his family's name is being trashed for something he didn't do. Detective Snow steps out of the interview room and comes back with Brooks' cell phone. He lays the phone down in front of Brooks and asks him to call the number of the person he had the 13-second conversation with at midnight the night Crystal vanished. While dialing the number, Brooks says, "Oh, yeah, Steve." Detective Snow asks him who Steve is, and Brooks says, "Steve Lawson, he works for me." Steve answers the phone, and the conversation can be heard through the speakerphone, and it sounds 100% staged.
I said it is a very difficult and trying time, but I appreciate you saying that. But hey, I need your help while I got you on the phone here. Do you remember the other night you called me really late, and I forgot what you asked me. Can you? I guess we wasn't on the phone. I might have been tired. I know it was pretty late at night. Can you remember what you asked me or what you were after? I can't remember. Yes, sir, I can. I called to ask you for them numbers for our house. Oh, for a rental house. Yes, sir. And what did I forgot? What did I tell you? You told me that you would call. What's her name, Katie or whatever? She handles all that. Crystal. Crystal. Okay, I apologize. Yeah.
Brooks seems satisfied with Steve's responses as he hangs up the phone, having his buddy co-sign his lies and saying all the right things on his behalf. Well, almost. The detective informs Brooks that if they left out at 11:45 that night, then they would have been about 15 minutes down the road and close to home when he spoke with Steve on the phone, and Brooks agrees. Detective Snow asks Brooks why he would need to call Crystal if she was right there in the truck with him. Brooks pauses for a second and then tells the detective that she just wouldn't want to deal with that stuff at that hour of the night. Approximately 12 minutes later, while Brooks's phone is still laying on the interview table, the phone suddenly rings and Brooks answers it on the first ring. It was Brooks's younger brother, Nick Houck, who is just 2 years younger. Nick Houck was a police officer for the Bardstown Police Department, where he had worked for the past 10 years.
No, I don't. I know. I'm not. I know that. But the way that I look at it is, I'm innocent. I ain't done nothing wrong. What I know you told me innocent people have got jammed up, but if you're telling me to leave, I'll get up and leave. If you want me to.
After the call, Brooks leaves the interview as advised by his brother, Officer Nick Houck. Approximately 2 hours after Brooks had left the interview at around 8 or 9 p.m., surveillance footage captures Nick Houck following behind Brooks Houck's truck down Highway 49 in his police cruiser and following him into the family farm driveway. They're both caught on camera leaving the farm a few hours later. On July the 9th, the day after Brooks was interviewed, having suspicion as to what Nick and Brooks were doing at the farm together until well after dark the night prior, police come to Nick's home and seize his police cruiser. Nick is also subpoenaed to testify in front of a grand jury on this day, to testify under oath that he did not actually tell Brooks to leave the interview, and that instead he has encouraged Brooks to fully cooperate. Members of the Houck family sat inside of the courtroom during the testimony, including Brooks Houck, the Houck brothers' mother, Rosemary Houck, and her partner, Larry, and Nick and Brooks' sister, Rhonda. Nick hadn't been very cooperative himself thus far. He had also declined to meet with detectives for an interview, and his behavior was just really odd. It was clear to authorities that he knew more than he led on to believe. Also on July the 9th, Brooks Houck appears on the popular CNN Headline News broadcast with Nancy Grace, where he claims he is 100% innocent in all of this and that his family's name is being trashed. When Nancy Grace asked him why he hadn't been involved in any of the many search efforts conducted in Bardstown to look for Crystal so far, Brooks tells her that he's been doing his own part behind the scenes to find Crystal. The following day, on July the 10th, Bardstown Police Chief Rick McCubbin calls Nick into his office to speak with him. He tells Nick that he needs to fully cooperate and meet with the detective to answer some questions. Nick again refuses, telling his boss that if he knew anything, he would have already told them. In an interview Brooke Ballard did with WHAS 11 News on July the 13th, 10 days after Crystal had vanished, Brooke tells the media that Brooks Houck's story doesn't add up and that he has been uncooperative with the investigation. On July the 15th, having been given direct order from his boss, Chief McCubbin, Nick Houck finally agrees to meet with Kentucky State Police detectives to be interviewed. And throughout the interview, Nick responds to majority of the questions with, "I don't know and I can't remember." Nick describes how he and his brother don't talk a lot because they're both just really busy and they usually just see one another in passing. And with that said, the detectives ask Nick if he remembers following behind Brooks' truck in his cruiser to the Houck's family farm on July the 8th, 2 hours after he had told his brother to leave the interview. And Nick says something like, "I may have went to the farm. If you say you have it on video, then yeah, okay." But he says that he was not following Brooks there. The detective then asks him if it was just coincidental that surveillance footage captures his police cruiser following right behind Brooks' truck all the way down Highway 49 and into the farm driveway entrance, and Nick says, yeah. They ask Nick what he and Brooks were doing at the farm that evening, and Nick says he can't remember. One thing I found interesting, though, is that Nick does tell the detectives that Brooks usually has a lot of leftover scrap lumber and materials from his construction business, and that he often burns trash there at the farm. Considering the fact that Nick really gave them no information and answered mostly every question with, "I don't know," and "I can't remember," and he definitely didn't offer up any additional information, I found this statement to be interesting because it was practically the only additional information he spoke of without having to be asked. And so it seemed as though Nick maybe wanted to give the detectives an explanation of why there was a fire lit on the farm the night of July the 3rd before they could even ask him. They then question him on calling Brooks during the interview on July the 8th and ask him if he instructed Brooks to leave the interview. Nick says that he didn't tell his brother to leave, but instead he was encouraging him to cooperate and to be careful how he answers questions. He said something along the line of he knew his brother had had a rough several days since Crystal's disappearance, and his words could easily be twisted up and used against him, so he was only cautioning him to be careful in how he answers the questions. The detectives also informed Nick that bloodhounds were walked around his cruiser and that they hit on the back quarter panel. Upon searching the trunk, they discovered his police-issued fire extinguisher that he is required to carry was missing from the trunk. They also questioned Nick about a blanket found in the trunk of his cruiser, to which Nick explains that he'd grabbed it from the skid house at the farm to use in between some furniture he was hauling, to prevent it from being scratched up. He says he intended to return the blanket to the skid house, but he had just not gotten around to it yet. The detectives informed Nick that a luminol test was performed on the trunk of his cruiser following the hit of the bloodhounds, and it lit up blue, and particularly a large amount on the blanket inside of his trunk. Luminol is used to detect the presence of any kind of bodily fluids, from sweat, urine, saliva, blood, vomit, any excretion that can come from a human body. Nick has no explanation for the luminol test detecting bodily fluids in the trunk of his cruiser and on the blanket, but he insists that none of the forensic testing will come back in connection to Crystal. He repeatedly insists that he knows absolutely nothing. Having gotten nothing out of Nick really, though, other than "I don't know" and "I can't remember," the detectives asked Nick if he would take a polygraph. Nick agreed and told them that he could probably do that on Monday, July the 20th. Nick had previously been asked to take one before the interview this day, and he refused. So 5 days later, on Monday, July the 20th, the FBI contacts Nick and asks him to come in for a polygraph, but Nick refuses because he is not on duty at the moment. 4 days later, on July 24th, they contact Nick again, and while he was on duty this time, Nick agrees to come in to take the polygraph. The examiner was an FBI polygraph examiner who had 25 years' experience. Upon completion of the test, the examiner called Chief McCubbin to express his grave concern with the results. Nick was brought back into the room with the examiner for another interview, and the examiner informed him that his results showed that he had failed the polygraph. The results revealed that he was being untruthful on a scale of greater than 99% about questions relating to Crystal Rogers, and in particularly whether or not he knew where she was right now. Nick continued to insist he knew nothing. The examiner kept reassuring him that he failed the test, so he does know more than he is saying. Nick began to get really irritated, which was quite a different reaction than in his first interview on July the 15th, when he was very calm and laid back. He continues to stand firm that he knew nothing. The examiner finally tells him, "We're past that. You do know, and this test just proved that." Nick gets really angry and curses the examiner, telling him, "I don't give a F what your stupid test says." Nick tells the examiner that he's talking crazy and asks him if that's all the questions he has for him at the moment, because they're going to continue to go round and round and disagree, and that he's about to just get up and leave. The examiner tells him that he's free to go, and Nick leaves the interview room. Although police had their suspicion, there was no real evidence to hold Nick or Brooks on, and the two brothers were free to return to their everyday lives in the community, while the rest of Bardstown conducted endless search efforts for the missing mother of five. Tommy and Sherry took in Crystal's four older children to raise, while Brooks still had custody of Eli, though the Ballards were able to get Eli on the weekends sometimes. The arrangements were pretty mutual towards the beginning, but each passing day with no answers built up more and more animosity between the Ballards and Brooks Houck, and eventually the visits with Eli stopped. On July 29th, Louisville Metro Police searched lakes around the area, but the 2-day search efforts turned up nothing in relation to Crystal's case. Tommy Ballard spent every chance he could searching for his daughter. He formed a group called Team Crystal, consisting of dozens of people in the community who devoted their weekends to searching. Several more signs went up all over Nelson County. You couldn't drive no more than just a few blocks without seeing a sign or billboard with Crystal's face on it. Tommy also had a large decal made for the back of his pickup truck with Crystal's missing persons information on it. The family and community also held several fundraising events where tens of thousands of dollars were raised towards the reward, and trust funds were started for Crystal's five children. The whole community really came together in support of the Ballard family. On August 14th, having not been able to see their grandson in several weeks, the Ballards filed a motion in court to fight for grandparents' visitation rights for Eli, but a judge ruled against it, and Eli remained with his father, Brooks Houck. August the 15th, Crystal's Impala was returned to the Ballard family after being processed for the prior 2 months. Crystal's parents stored the car inside of a storage unit belonging to Crystal. On September the 9th, Nick Houck is suspended from the Bardstown Police Department for suspicion of interfering with the investigation. Approximately a month later, on October the 14th, Nick signs an affidavit saying that he told Brooks to fully cooperate with the Nelson County Sheriff's Office. The next day, on October the 15th, a hearing is held in Mayor John Royalty's office to discuss Nick Houck's possible termination. And on the very next day, October the 16th, 2015, Bardstown Police Chief Rick McCubbin, Mayor John Royalty, and City Attorney Tim Butler held a press conference to announce that Nick Houck had officially been terminated from the Bardstown Police Department for being uncooperative with investigators and for hindering the investigation into Crystal Rogers' disappearance. Chief McCubbin spoke to the press, saying that he, Nick, injected himself into this. He made that call. Initially, he wasn't even on the radar, but by him making that call, he therefore entered himself into the investigation. During the press conference, they pleaded for the community to come forth with any information or tips they may have. The Nelson County Sheriff told the press that at this time, Rogers is presumed dead, and they officially named Brooks Houck as a suspect publicly. In December 2015, police made their first arrest in connection to Crystal's case. 52-year-old Danny Singleton had been an employee of Brooks Houck's for several years and was considered to be his right-hand man. Singleton had given testimony to the grand jury back on September the 16th, and he was arrested 3 months later on December the 16th for 38 counts of perjury. The indictment against him stated that during his testimony he made a material false statement which he did not believe 38 times while under oath in front of a Nelson County grand jury. In other words, he knowingly lied to the grand jury 38 times. However, the following year, Singleton pled out to a lesser charge of false swearing and served about 8 months in jail before he was released on probation. In January of 2016, the Ballards filed a motion in court to keep Brooks Houck from leaving the state with Eli. With all of the pressure and public scrutiny the Houcks were facing, they feared that Brooks may run off with their 3-year-old grandson. Tommy and Sherry continued to fight for visitation rights with Eli, and finally, after several court hearings, a judge granted the Ballards alternating weekend visits. And sometime around the beginning of 2016, the private investigator that the Ballards hired received an anonymous tip that led to a major development in the case. Someone reported seeing a white Buick car parked in a peculiar location on the Houck family farm the same night that Crystal disappeared. When the Ballards learned of this information, they didn't know where a white Buick car could have came from and who may have owned one, until police soon after discovered that Brooks's 82-year-old grandmother, Anna Whitesides, had owned a white Buick car. Police show up at Anna Whiteside's door with a search warrant to seize the car. The grandmother told authorities that she did own a 16-year-old white Buick car, but that she had sold it to a dealership in Louisville back in July of 2015, just a few weeks after Crystal's disappearance. Of course, that was automatically suspicious. Police issued a subpoena for the 82-year-old woman to testify in front of a Nelson County grand jury as to why the car was sold off so soon after Crystal's disappearance. Prosecutors were suspicious that the Buick may have been used to dispose of a body and then cleaned up and quickly sold off in an effort to prevent authorities from finding evidence from that vehicle. However, Anna Whitesides refused to testify in front of a grand jury and instead exercised her Fifth Amendment right. Her attorney, Jason Floyd, spoke on her behalf, saying that the two statements that Whitesides gave police, along with the information of the buyer of the car, was enough. A hearing was scheduled for a week later, on June the 15th, 2016, to determine whether or not Whitesides would be required to testify. Ultimately, a judge ruled that any future proceedings involving Miss Whitesides would remain in confidentiality. Authorities did, however, track that Buick down and seized it from the dealership to be processed in a forensic crime lab. A blonde hair that was 7/8 of an inch long and very similar in appearance to Crystal Rogers' hair was recovered from the trunk of that white Buick. It was collected into evidence to be tested for a DNA profile. The 82-year-old grandmother of Brooks Houck has since passed away and was never charged in connection to the case. On August the 9th of 2016, Sherry Ballard speaks with Megyn Kelly on the Today Show in an effort to get Crystal's case more publicity. Sometime around August of 2016, Sherry says that her husband Tommy confides in her that he knows someone is watching him and following him around. Tommy had installed cameras around his property not long after Crystal disappeared and even had a dash camera inside of his pickup truck. Since his daughter's disappearance, he had become a big advocate for encouraging people to always watch what's going on around them. Also in August of 2016, the Houck family farm is searched again. Nelson County Sheriff's Office, Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, Louisville Metro Police Department, and the FBI searched the 250-acre farm for at least 2 days using more than 14 cadaver dogs in their aid. In the early morning hours of Saturday, November the 19th, 2016, tragedy would strike the Ballard family once again. Tommy and his 12-year-old grandson, Trenton, which is Crystal's son, went out on the Ballards' private property to go deer hunting. Casey Ballard and his son came along, but they stayed up near the front of the farm while Tommy and Trenton went back toward the back, which was several fields away. This part of the farm was a secluded area that connected to the Bluegrass Parkway highway, and Casey said it was Tommy's favorite area on the farm. Casey says that he and his father have hunted on this farm every year for the past 10 or 12 years. Just before 8 a.m., Trenton had walked back over towards the truck that they had arrived in to get something, and Tommy stayed out in the open field waiting on Trenton to return. Casey describes hearing a loud and sudden echo of a gunshot from several fields away where he and his son were hunting. Tommy called out to his grandson saying that he had been hit by something, and Trenton ran over to Tommy frantically to find him on the ground with a gunshot wound to the chest. Trenton called Sherry and Casey and 911. Sherry and Casey rushed over to the location, and Sherry says she shook her husband frantically, begging him to wake up, but it was too late. Tommy succumbed to his injury before emergency medics even arrived on the scene. The gunshot wound had entered through his chest and exited out through his back. Suicide was ruled out as investigators were able to determine that Tommy hadn't even fired his weapon that morning, and the grandson was cleared as well for the same reason. Initially, police labeled Tommy's death a freak accident where he was shot by another hunter. Sherry and members of the Ballard family were livid. They knew this was no accident. This was premeditated murder. Tommy Ballard was a force to be reckoned with when it came to finding his daughter and finding out what happened to her. He spent countless hours searching, putting together his own documents, interviewing people himself, creating maps, and marking off where they have searched and where they're going to search next. And he had a box of evidence that he himself had collected of items of interest that he had found in these searches. His life revolved around getting justice for Crystal, and Tommy never backed up or let off. He only went stronger and harder to find out the truth, and many believe because of that, Tommy was murdered. In 2017, Sherry Ballard makes a statement in an interview with news outlets. If we can find the person who killed my daughter, then we will have found the person who killed my husband too. In that same interview, Sherry Ballard also says, Crystal was killed because she overheard something about Officer Jason Ellis's murder that she shouldn't have. Sherry never confirms how she knows this information or why she believes this or if Crystal had ever mentioned this to her. A strange occurrence happened in July of 2017. Dozens of signs along the roadways with missing Crystal Rogers information on them that people were so used to seeing all over Bardstown had suddenly disappeared, and eventually the sign thief was caught on surveillance camera in action stealing a yard sign from a local gas station that read, Standing with the Ballards. Brooks Houck's new girlfriend, Crystal Maupin, was arrested for theft, but bonded out 30 minutes afterwards. 2 months later, in September of 2017, Maupin pled guilty to theft by unlawful taking. Maupin was sentenced to 2 years of probation and ordered to write an apology letter to Sherry Ballard. She was also ordered to have no contact with the Ballard family. On July 18, 2018, state and federal agencies were at Brooks Houck's doorstep yet again with another search warrant. However, this time it was in no reference to anything pertaining to Crystal's disappearance. A local Lowe's store had been investigating a theft from their store where 200 bundles of roofing shingles had been stolen on 4 separate days within an 11-day time span. Police spent about an hour executing that search warrant and confiscated shingles and three other evidence bags and a computer modem from the home. Brooks Houcks was placed under arrest and charged with 4 felony counts of theft. He was facing up to 20 years if convicted. He was lodged in the Nelson County Detention Center and given a $25,000 full cash bond. On August the 11th of 2018, Crystal's disappearance aired on Investigation Discovery and Oxygen Network in a six-part series entitled The Disappearance of Crystal Rogers. The show's host, Stephanie Barr, visited Bardstown, Kentucky, and brought along with her an expert homicide detective, Dwayne Stanton, who has worked over 750 homicide investigations, including celebrity cases. When they discovered that Crystal's car had been parked and preserved in a storage unit just how it had came back from the crime lab, they were eager to take a second look at the car. Forensics reconstructive specialist Joey Stidham, who was also a former Kentucky State Police trooper, reprocessed the preserved car. Stidham says that KSP Crime Lab typically only accepts 10 pieces of evidence for testing and murder investigations, and so the team of three wondered if maybe some other important pieces of evidence in the car had been overlooked. Numerous other evidence bags were collected. One such item was a hairbrush found inside of the car belonging to Rogers. They used a cadaver dog to check the vehicle for possible traces of human remains and were astounded when the dog made a hard hit by continuously barking and even jumping inside of the trunk. The dog's owner called it unusual behavior and said she had never seen him react so strongly. A luminol test was conducted on the trunk following the dog's hit, and a significant stain was discovered. However, it did not turn out to be of human blood. Bauer and Stanton then became interested in Tommy's evidence box that he had collected. Sherry Ballard spoke of her husband's tireless efforts, telling the docu-series, "From the minute my daughter started missing, my husband was like the investigator. If he wasn't physically looking for my daughter, he was on the internet looking at everything." Countless hours Tommy had spent in putting this evidence box together, from taking notes of rumors and other things he'd heard, surveillance footage, conducting his own interviews, videotapes, locations, addresses, maps. Dwayne Stanton spoke, saying, "I've been doing this for 40 years and I've never seen anything like it." He referenced how everything in the box was neatly organized, categorized, and just all around well put together. Barr and Stanton came across something inside of the box that had never been publicly surfaced. Video surveillance from July the 3rd of 2015 of Crystal Rogers shopping in Walmart with Eli. The timestamp of the footage was 4:36 p.m. A note found inside of Tommy's evidence box stated that a neighbor witnessed Crystal return home around 5 p.m. that day on July the 3rd and carry bags inside of her house. These pieces of evidence filled a gap in the timeline from the day of July the 3rd, and it was the last known surveillance footage of Crystal Rogers right before she disappeared. Based on these two pieces of evidence, we know that Crystal was still alive at least by 5 p.m. on July the 3rd of 2015. The documentary also took a look into Tommy's death and compared it with similarities to another unsolved murder in Bardstown. On May 25th of 2013, Bardstown police officer and canine handler Jason Ellis was returning home from work after completing his shift. He traveled the same route down Bluegrass Parkway every day to and from work. Around 3 a.m. that morning on his way home, Ellis noticed a large tree branch across the roadway on the ramp to exit 34. Ellis pulled over onto the side of the road and exited his cruiser and was shot 3 times just as he bent down to grab the branch. Upon investigation, they discovered that Ellis's weapon was still in his holster and hadn't been removed, and the tree limb lying across the roadway was from a freshly cut branch. Investigators say the tree branch was staged and manually laid across the roadway in an effort to lure Ellis out of his vehicle. The comparison of Ellis's murder to Tommy's has several similarities in the level of planning, the execution styles, the locations, and both having been carried out by a skilled gunsman. In the fourth episode of Oxygen's The Disappearance of Crystal Rogers series, Barr and Stanton take an even deeper look into Tommy's evidence box and discovered a letter written to the Ballard family by a prison inmate dated back in February of 2016. The inmate claimed to have information about Roger's disappearance as well as two other unsolved murders in Bardstown. The inmate claimed in the letter that he has tried to notify Bardstown Police Department twice by letter of the information he has on all three cases, but he says that none of the officers from the Bardstown Police Department have bothered to come and visit him or inquire about the information. When the Ballards went to meet with the inmate in prison, he was moved to another prison that same day. When the oxygen crew went to meet with the inmate, he was suspiciously moved again. The inmate finally reached out to the Oxygen Network and spoke with them, disclosing information he allegedly knew about Crystal's disappearance, as well as 33-year-old Officer Jason Ellis's murder in May of 2013, and the double homicide of 48-year-old teacher Kathy Netherland and her daughter, 16-year-old Samantha, who were both brutally murdered inside of their Bardstown home in April of 2014. The inmate says he overheard another inmate saying that Crystal wasn't in Bardstown, but possibly in an area called White's Mill and Highway 62. He talked about the double homicide of the mother and daughter duo, saying that there was no forced entry and that a cell phone jammer was placed at the front door to kill all cell phone signals. He went on to give information he had on Officer Jason Ellis's murder, claiming that three guys planned it inside of his basement. He says it was a hired hit, and one of the three men stood on the highway advising the shooters as to when Ellis was approaching, and the other two men, the shooters, stood on opposite sides of Bluegrass Parkway in case one missed, the other could shoot. He says that Ellis was killed because he was investigating a string of storage unit robberies containing antiques and drugs. He claims that the shotgun used to kill Officer Ellis was destroyed with a cutting torch and vise, in which the inmate claims he still has. There has been a lot of talk that Brooks Houck was allegedly involved in illegal drug activity that Officer Ellis and his K-9 were investigating. However, there has been no proof or evidence, and no proof of the inmate's claims have been confirmed yet either. In another custody review hearing for Eli later on in 2018, the Houck family says that Sherry is manipulating Eli. Brooks Houck testified that after returning from visits with his grandmother, his son was uncooperative and that he is extremely accusatory, asking questions such as, "What did you do to my mommy?" and "Everyone wants to know." A three-panel judge ruled that it was no longer in the child's best interest to be in the middle of the contention and animosity between the Ballard and the Houck families, and Sherry's alternating weekend visits would abruptly end until the court could issue a final ruling. 3 months later, in February of 2019, Sherry filed another order to review for visitations, stating that she will never stop fighting to get to see her grandson, but a judge denied it. On February the 6th of 2019, Sherry Ballard appeared on the Dr. Phil show in hopes of bringing more attention to Crystal's case. At this time, Tommy's death was still labeled an accident by authorities, but Sherry told Dr. Phil that she believes it was intentional and that her husband's death and her daughter's disappearance are related. Former FBI profiler Candace DeLong was a special guest on the show, and she agreed with Sherry, saying, "There is a reason he was shot and killed in the open field. The shooter was sending a message to you and anyone else who is sticking their nose in the case of Crystal to find out where she is." She goes on to make another statement to try to comfort Sherry by saying, "Fortunately for you, all of this publicity will help keep you safe." The FBI profiler went on to say that whoever shot Tommy was skilled in firearms. Dr. Phil said that he hoped the outcome of the show would result in more tips and leads being called in. "Somebody out there knows something," he said. And just a few days after the segment aired on national television, the Nelson County Sheriff's Office confirmed that they had in fact received several new tips called into their office because of the Dr. Phil show, and that they were investigating each one. On April the 25th of 2019, Brooks House was acquitted of the felony theft charges from Lowe's after a trial jury found him not guilty, mostly due to the fact that some of the employees from the store knew about the thefts and carelessly turned the other cheek. Basically, one department was loading the shingles up and printing off a ticket, which the customer would then take to the checkout to pay. One witness who worked at Lowe's and checked Houck out in one of the 4 days in question said, "I'm pretty sure he told them to load more shingles than what was actually printed on the ticket, and the ticket was never seen." Houck's defense attorney, Brian Butler, criticized Lowe's for their inadequate training of its employees and the staff's lack of attention. Butler said that the loss prevention employees didn't properly investigate the alleged thefts before the charges were filed against Houck. Prosecutor Joe Ballard admitted that Lowe's did make some mistakes, but said, "Just because someone is letting you take shingles doesn't mean you have the right to do it." Ballard also stated that rich people steal too. Brooks escaped a possible 20-year prison sentence. One witness, who was also an employee, stated that when Houck discovered he was being investigated for the thefts, he came to her asking for her help to resolve the issue.
She says she told Houck that if he was in fact guilty, he would have to man up and face it, and there was nothing she could do at that point. Sherry Ballard was in the courtroom during the whole trial and was disappointed in the verdict, saying he just got away with something else again. I just can't believe it. In August of 2020, FBI took over Rogers' case. FBI Assistant Special Agent Brian Jones told the press that he believes answers in Rogers' case could lead to answers in other unsolved cases in Bardstown. Jason Ellis's family agreed. The FBI dispatched 100 state and federal law enforcement officers to execute 9 federal search warrants relating to Rogers' disappearance and accusations of tax fraud. They searched Brooks Houck's home on Glenview Drive, and members of the IRS left with dozens of boxes, 2 filing cabinets, keys, computers, and more. Nick Houck's home was also searched, as well as the Houck family farm and the storage unit belonging to Crystal where her Impala was being kept. The car was towed into the forensics lab for further analysis. They also searched the property again where the grandmother Anna Whitesides had lived before her passing. The search of the farm lasted several days, and tents and mobile crime units could be seen lodged on the farm during the entire search effort. The farm had been searched numerous times already by this point, and several items had been collected into evidence from those searches and sent off to forensic labs. Police have publicly stated that they strongly believe a crime occurred on that farm involving Crystal Rogers. Authorities also searched the farmhouse located on the family farm in which Brooks's mother, Rosemary Houck, lives. During that search, FBI found secretly recorded tapes of 5 members of the Houck family's grand jury testimonies from 2015 inside of a coat pocket belonging to Rosemary. They also stated that they had recovered multiple items of interest, although they've still yet to elaborate on what those items were. But those items of interest were sent to the FBI lab in Virginia for forensic analysis. FBI began a 4-day search of properties Houck had built in the Woodlawn Springs neighborhood, where they dug up an entire concrete driveway and announced to finding an item of interest. October the 17th of 2022, the FBI and local police departments executed another search warrant of the Houck family farm on Pascal Ballard Lane. In September of 2023, a major development in Crystal's case came to light following the September the 7th arrest of 32-year-old Nelson County resident Joseph Lawson. Lawson was charged with criminal conspiracy to commit murder and complicity to tampering with physical evidence. He pleaded not guilty in Nelson County Circuit Court, and his bond was set at $500,000 full cash. Joseph Lawson was an employee of Brooks Houck. Joseph testified to the grand jury in 2023 that Houck said he wanted his wife gone. However, he says he didn't think Houck was being serious. Joseph testified that Houck did call him and ask him to move a vehicle for him the night of July the 3rd, 2015. Joseph says that he drove Crystal's maroon Chevy Impala down Bluegrass Parkway, where he eventually got a flat tire around mile marker 14. He says he called his father, Steve Lawson, to come and pick him up from that location. Joseph also testified that he did not know why he was moving the vehicle, and he didn't ask why, he only did what was asked of him. 20 days later, on September the 27th of 2023, Brooks Houck was arrested and charged with complicity to murder and tampering with physical evidence. Houck was seen in handcuffs being escorted into police custody, where he was transferred over to Hardin County Jail and given a bond of $10 million full cash. Soon after his arrest, Brooks Houck's attorney filed a motion with the court for a bond reduction hearing, citing that the $10 million bond was unconstitutional and that Brooks is a low-risk defendant, but Judge Charles Sim denied that motion. 2 days after Brooks' arrest, Sherry Ballard and Rosemary Houck were in the Nelson County Justice Center for a closed hearing for emergency custody of Eli. The hearing was continued, and it is unclear who Eli was staying with after his father's arrest. Brooks Houck was arraigned in court on October the 5th of 2023, and a lot of shocking information come to light during this court appearance. Brooks' attorney, Brian Butler, filed a motion for Judge Charles Sims to be disqualified from the case
due to many years of bias to Houck due to Nick's uncharged misconduct. Butler also filed another motion for Brooks's bond to be lowered again, but Judge Sims denied that request and Brooks's bond remained at $10 million. During the arraignment, Special Prosecutor Shane Young tells the court that he believes they are in possession of the rifle used to murder Tommy Ballard. Young says that an undercover agent purchased that rifle from Nick Houck, who was using a fake name during the transaction of the rifle. Young tells the courtroom that the rifle is the same 12-gauge caliber used in Tommy's murder and that through forensic testing thus far, 4 out of 5 comparisons of the weapon match up to be the rifle used to kill Tommy Ballard. Young told the courtroom that Brooks Houcks was being eyed in connection to the murder of Tommy Ballard, and although it already seemed to be the popular speculation that Houck was somehow involved in Crystal Rogers' father's death, it was still a shock to publicly hear it for the first time that authorities were in fact attempting to make that connection. Also during this court appearance, Prosecutor Young told the courtroom about the FBI finding the Houck family's secretly recorded grand jury testimonies from 2015 during the FBI's search warrant of the family farm. This was the first time that that information had been made known to the courts and into the public. Even the Houck family was not aware that authorities had known that they had secretly recorded the testimonies until Young announced it in the courtroom on this day. 5 days later, on October the 10th, Rosemary Houck withdrew her custody request of Eli. Eli was 2.5 when his mother went missing in 2015. During this time, though, he was now 10 years old, soon to be 11. During Brooks's arraignment 5 days earlier, Rosemary was named one of the 5 family members who secretly recorded the grand jury testimonies. On December the 6th of 2023, Kentucky State Police and the FBI execute another massive search in a wooded area located on the Nelson and Bullock County lines, off of Thompson Hill Road and Cox Creek. The search was initiated by the prosecutor's office following the discovery of one suspect's phone location pinging in that area for several hours the night Crystal disappeared. The search involved an excavator, which authorities were seen digging a large hole by neighbors in the area, who also said that police seemed to be focused on 2 properties across the street from each other on Thompson Hill Road. On December the 8th of 2023, 54-year-old Steve Lawson was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder and complicity to tampering with physical evidence. Steve Lawson is the father of Joseph Lawson, the first to be arrested in connection to Crystal's disappearance just 3 months prior. Steve testified to the grand jury that he drove Joseph over to initially pick up the car and that Joseph drove the car down Bluegrass Parkway until he got a flat tire, at which time he called him to come and pick him up. Steve told the grand jury that he picked his son up from the location of the abandoned Impala near mile marker 14 at around 11:50 p.m. He testifies that he pushed the driver's seat of Crystal's car up further as Crystal was shorter than his son Joseph was, and that he also reached behind the driver's seat and retrieved a mini Louisville Slugger baseball bat that his son Joseph Lawson carried around with him everywhere he went. He told the grand jury that once he picked his son up and drove away from Crystal's car, he called Brooks Houck around midnight and told him the job was done. Steve also testified that after police seized Brooks' phone, that Brooks told him if he was questioned about that midnight phone call to just say that he had talked to him about some rental properties. Steve Lawson also told police that on July the 4th of 2015, he saw his son Joseph and a man named Jeremy Thompson digging around with a skid steer and burning wood piles in a wooded area at 400 Thompson Hill Road, which initiated that FBI search 2 days prior to Steve's arrest. Steve said that David Thompson had asked them to burn large amounts of wood. Now, David Thompson is the father of Jeremy Thompson, and later on at trial, we learn that the Lawsons' phones ping at Thompson Hill Road for about 4 hours the day after Crystal disappeared, which is consistent with Steve's claim that his son Joseph and Jeremy were digging with a skid steer and burning wood piles on that day on July the 4th. David and Jeremy Thompson own this property, and Jeremy also allegedly ran an illegal chop shop on Thompson Hill Road, which is where Joseph initially drove Crystal's car to get rid of it before they went with the alternate plan to abandon it in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, which, according to Steve, is where Joseph was headed with Crystal's car when he got the flat tire on Bluegrass Parkway and had to abandon it there around mile marker 14. Interesting enough, however, 68-year-old David Thompson passed away on September the 5th of 2021, 6 years after Crystal went missing, and his son, 46-year-old Jeremy Thompson, passed away about a year later on November the 20th of 2022, following a hunting accident. Of course, we don't really know the details surrounding their deaths, but odd how all these names of people that we hear allegedly involved in some kind of way, whether it be with her actual disappearance or the cover up, have since passed away and can't be called to testify. At a February the 9th court hearing to determine whether or not all three suspects in Crystal's disappearance would be tried together, prosecutor Shane Young drops another bombshell in the courtroom. Young, who has also been appointed to prosecute three notorious unsolved murder cases in Bardstown, including Crystal Rogers, her father Tommy Ballard, and Bardstown police officer and canine handler Jason Ellis, tells the judge that discovery in Rogers's case exceeds more than a terabyte of storage, including thousands of documents, hundreds of hours of police interviews, and possible evidence from previous searches conducted by three law enforcement agencies. Young goes on to say that the discovery for Rogers' case also includes investigative files into Tommy Ballard's case and Jason Ellis's case. He says that evidence from Officer Ellis's case is somehow wrapped up with evidence in Rogers' case. Young told the judge that when they received the case, it took 6 months to go through discovery, and that included Ellis and Ballard. He also told the judge that there seems to be similar people connected to each case in some ways, without saying too much. Of course, this was another popular speculation that many people had, but it still came as a shock to finally hear that investigators had indeed made some kind of connection between the three cases. On March the 11th of 2024, Brooks Houck has a court hearing for another motion to reduce his bond, filed by his attorney Brian Butler. By this time, Brooks had been incarcerated for nearly 5 months, and his bond remained the same as it was since the day he had been arrested. Brooks's attorneys had been fighting to try to get his bond lowered since his arrest. During this hearing, his attorney Brian Butler argued that it was unconstitutional to not lower his bond and that it violated Brooks's rights as the $10 million bond amount was unreasonable and oppressive. Butler accused Judge Sims of basically trying to take advantage of the fact that Houck is wealthy. He tells the courtroom that Houck has been cooperative since day one in the investigation, that Bardstown is his hometown where he was raised and the town he loves, and he never took off and left out during all those years of public hatred and scrutiny since Crystal's disappearance, and that he was not planning to leave now. Butler also says that Houck being locked up makes it harder to communicate with him to build a defense. He mentions Houck being a great father and that his son needs him outside of jail, and that Brooks's businesses employ many people in the community and they need him as well. Butler says no murder suspect on trial in Kentucky has ever had a bond greater than $2 million, and lists several examples all over Kentucky of names of people charged with murder and their bond amounts. He accuses the judge of making an unfair example out of his client. He asked the judge once again for a bond reduction from $10 million to $500,000 full cash, and for conditions of the release to include house arrest with an ankle monitor and Brooks only to be allowed out of his home to go to work. Judge Sims once again denies the motion for bond reduction, stating that Brooks Houck has a vast amount of financial resources. Judge Sims also cited the Houck family's interference with the investigation and the severity of the alleged crime. This was the third motion filed on Brooks's behalf to try to get his bond lowered, which exceeds the limit, and therefore Brooks Houck's bond will remain at $10 million up until his trial date, which is scheduled for June of 2025. Houck's attorney then filed an appeal with the Kentucky Court of Appeals, again claiming that the bond amount is excessive and that Brooks is a low-risk defendant, but the Court of Appeals denied to appeal the judge's ruling, citing that Brooks constituted a danger to potential witnesses, and although the bond amount may be high, a capital crime like murder is eligible for the denial of bond altogether. In August of 2024, Steve fires his public attorney, Ted Levitt, telling Judge Charles Sims that Levitt isn't doing his job. His original trial date had been pushed back to May of 2025, but just weeks before that trial was set to begin, Steve's newly appointed attorney, Darren Wolf, argued that they wanted the two hairs found in Crystal's car back in 2015 and preserved into evidence to be tested because those hairs could produce a new suspect such as Nick Houck. The hairs had been kept into evidence but had never actually been tested as the process would consume the evidence sample altogether. Judge Sims ruled that the hairs could be tested, but it would have to be done so at the expense of the Commonwealth. Prosecutor Shane Young argued that these tests would delay the trial even longer and cost his office tens of thousands of dollars. Young said he is not going to waste the time and the money. The results of testing those hairs would either come back to belonging to Steve or Joseph Lawson or they wouldn't. But regardless, both of the Lawson suspects testified before a grand jury admitting to being inside of Crystal Rogers' car the night she disappeared. So to delay Steve Lawson's trial date and waste tens of thousands of dollars to wait on the testing of the two hairs is irrelevant anyway in Steve's case. Judge Sims ultimately did rule that the hairs collected did not have enough evidentiary relevance to make it worth spending the thousands of dollars and pushing the trial date back for several months while they awaited the results, and so Steve Lawson's trial date remained on schedule. On September the 5th of 2024, the FBI, Kentucky State Police, and local police agencies executed another search warrant at the property of Anna Whitesides on Whitesides Drive off of Cox Creek. The property was formerly owned by Brooks Houck's grandmother, Anna Whitesides, who was questioned about selling her white Buick car that a witness says was spotted on the farm the night of Crystal's disappearance. Authorities were seen searching the property for 3 days. They particularly seemed interested in an area near a tree line on the back side of the property. Tents were seen set up and tarps marked off an area where they used an excavator to dig. Steve Lawson's May 2025 trial date remained on schedule, and the first day of trial began on May 27, 2025, in Bowling Green, Kentucky. The trial was moved outside of Nelson County and into Warren County due to the massive amount of pretrial publicity, although really, the entire case has pretty well caught the attention of not just residents of Kentucky from the beginning, but tons of people throughout all the United States as well. Initially, Steve was offered immunity for providing truthful information about Roger's disappearance to police, but that was forfeited after Steve's story kept changing over and over. Steve testified to a grand jury on three separate occasions in 2023, once in May, once in June, and last in September. In May, he denied any involvement at all and says that he was at his home the night of July the 3rd, 2015, when Crystal went missing. In June, he told the grand jury that the phone call he made to Brooks Houck at midnight on the night of Crystal's disappearance was to inform him that the job was done, or in other words, the car had been moved. In September, however, Steve told the grand jury that Houck wanted his girlfriend gone, and to me that means he wanted her deceased, Lawson told the grand jury. He says that he told Houck he wasn't the man for that job, meaning he wanted no involvement, but says he recommended another employee, Charlie Girdley, to Houck. During his trial, Steve told the jury his only involvement was picking up his son Joseph from the location that Crystal's car was driven to before it had gotten a flat tire, and pushing the driver's seat of Crystal's car forward and removing his son Joseph's mini Louisville Slugger baseball bat from the back seat. Steve says otherwise he doesn't know what happened. He doesn't even know if a murder was committed. Steve tells the jury the reason he did this was because Brooks Houck promised him more work. When asked what his relationship was like between he and his son Joseph, Steve answered, "Poor. I don't always like him, but I'll always love him." Charlie Girdley, who also worked for Houck, took the witness stand during Steve's trial and told the jury that he and Joseph Lawson met up with Brooks Houck on July the 3rd after they had finished working for the day. Girdley says that he picked up a check from Brooks Houck while Joseph Lawson picked up something different from Houck, a set of keys. Girdley testified that he was told that Lawson was going to be doing some maintenance work on the car. Girdley also testified that Steve Lawson confided in him that Houck had asked him for help with getting rid of his old lady. Girdley says that Steve told him that he was not the man for the kind of job, but instead Steve suggested Girdley for the job. Girdley says he blew this comment off by laughing.
When asked by the defense why he hadn't come forth with any of these details back when he was interviewed by police in 2015 and again in 2016, Girdley replied that he did not want to get in trouble for something he had no involvement in. A total of 10 witnesses took the stand to testify during his trial, some of which testified to describe Steve's odd behavior back in July of 2015 around the time Crystal disappeared. Prosecutor Shane Young questioned one witness, Elizabeth Chesser, regarding a statement Steve allegedly made to her back in 2017. Elizabeth, who has a child with Steve's son Joseph Lawson, and whose mother was dating Steve Lawson back in 2017 when she lived with her mother, testified that Steve Lawson told her, Tammy knew I had committed murder, and she was going to turn on me, so I was going to leave her. Steve had been married to Tammy at least back in 2015 during Crystal's disappearance up until July the 4th, 2017, when Tammy Lawson passed away. Elizabeth's mother and Steve began dating towards the end of 2017, just a few months following his wife Tammy Lawson's death. Chessers testified that Steve Lawson also told her, no evidence, no case, referring to the fact that Crystal's body had yet to be recovered. Chesser told the jury that she had not gone to the police until much later on because she didn't know that Steve Lawson was making these statements to her in reference of Crystal Rogers until she watched the docuseries on Oxygen Network in 2018 and recognized Steve's voice. The defense pressed Chesser about previous drug use, to which Chesser admitted that she was pregnant at the time and drying out from addiction, and that's why she was living with her mother, and says that she was sober at the time that this conversation occurred between she and Steve. Defense attorney asked Chester if the docuseries or any other documentary pertaining to Roger's case could have influenced her memory, and Chester replies telling him, "That's not something you forget." Elizabeth Chesser went on to further testify that Lawson told her that she'd be next if she said anything. Another witness to take the stand was Stacy Cranmer, a former employee of Brooks Houcks who built decks and installed insulation for the Houcks Construction Company. Cranmer also worked alongside with Steve Lawson around the same time Crystal disappeared. Cranmer testified that while she worked for Houck in 2015, she saw Brooks and Steve riding around together in a truck where one of the job sites were located, just days before Crystal disappeared. Cranmer says that this was unusual of Brooks and that she later asked Steve what they were doing. Cranmer testified that Steve told her, "I've got to take care of something." She says Steve went on to further tell her, "I've got to take care of this girl. She has 5 kids and she's not doing real good." Cranmer says she asked Steve if that meant he was trying to help her to get into rehab, and she says that Steve replied to her saying, "No, I wish that was the case." As Cranmer was being questioned by the defense about watching documentaries pertaining to Rogers' case and speaking with prosecutors, she became defensive with the defense attorneys and told them they have something to do with it, all of them, she said, speaking of Houck and both of the Lawsons. Another witness to take the stand was Melissa Dover, a crime and intelligence analyst. Dover reviewed numerous calls and text messages between the 3 suspects in the days following Crystal's disappearance. Dover tells the jury that she was able to retrieve a deleted call from July the 8th from Houck to Steve Lawson. She also revealed a series of calls from the night Crystal disappeared between Steve Lawson, his former wife Tammy Lawson, Joseph Lawson, and Brooks Houck. Among these calls was the 13-second call from Steve. Investigators determined that shortly after that 13-second call, Lawson's phone was traced back to Bluegrass Parkway. So I want to take a moment and discuss Tammy Lawson. Her phone records pinged to being with the Lawsons the night of July the 3rd, and several phone calls being made back and forth between her phone and all 3 suspects. The prosecutor, Shane Young, did say during Steve's trial that if Tammy were still alive, she would also have been charged along with them. During Elizabeth Chesser's testimony, she says that Joseph told her if she told anyone that she would be next. I've thought about that, and I just wonder who exactly is he referring to that she would be next after? Does he mean that she would be next after Crystal or next after Tammy Lawson? Tammy's death, in my opinion, is very suspicious.
Tammy died in her home at the age of only 46 years old on July the 4th, 2017, and that's exactly 2 years to the day of Crystal's disappearance. According to the medical examiner, her cause of death is listed as complications of acute intoxication from a combination of cocaine, methadone, and gabapentin. Tammy passed away at her home that she shared with Steve Lawson, and it is also alleged that Steve and Joseph were home too at the time, but no one called for help. Her body was cremated following her death. According to Tammy's daughter, her mother had been drug dependent ever since an alleged accidental shooting in 2009. Allegedly, Tammy was making a bed when a gun fell out onto the floor and discharged, shooting her in the stomach. She could have ingested the drugs herself. I don't know. I don't want to make any false accusations. But again, it's just wild how all these names we hear of people potentially involved in some kind of way are no longer here. I would say her death should have probably been further looked into, but it's too late now since her body was cremated.
Detective John Snow also took the witness stand. He was the lead detective of Roger's case from the time she disappeared in 2015 up until the FBI took over the case in 2020. Defense attorney Zach Buckler questioned Snow on the evidence they collected from Crystal's car. Buckler asked Snow about another piece of evidence collected during another search in 2018 by private investigators Stidham and Stanton, who retrieved a hairbrush belonging to Crystal Rogers from her car. Buckler argued that that hairbrush found in the car, along with two hairs collected back in 2015 from the floorboard and driver's seat, were never compared to samples from the FBI's CODIS database, and if they had been, a new potential suspect could have come from those tests. CODIS is a database that contains DNA samples for over 23 million people. When asked if the possibility that additional suspects could be involved changes his view on Lawson's alleged involvement, Snow replied saying, "Not in any way." Detective Snow also testified that during his investigation, he discovered that one of Crystal's daughters saw Crystal leave their home with Brooks Houck the evening of July the 3rd of 2015, and that they went to the farm and that Crystal never returned home with him. Prosecutor Shane Young told the jury that activity from Steve's cell phone, which was inconsistent with his statements, helped to establish his guilt. Young says that initially Steve Lawson insisted that he was home the night that Crystal disappeared, but his phone's location revealed otherwise. Steve's phone pinged at a property on Thompson Hill Road during the overnight hours of July the 3rd into July the 4th for about 4 hours.
Remember, this is where the alleged chop shop was located, owned by Jeremy Thompson, who Steve also testified he witnessed his son Joseph and the property owner, Jeremy Thompson, digging a large hole with a skid steer along the wooded tree line and burning wood. Charlie Girdley, the man who Steve recommended to help get rid of Crystal, testified that Joseph Lawson said he was going to bury Crystal's car where no one could find it. Steve Lawson was tried separately due to multiple different contradicting stories he initially gave detectives. It was only after investigators revealed to Steve that his phone ping locations were not consistent with his statements that Steve began to come clean. In closing arguments, prosecutor Jim Lazowski says that an overwhelming amount of evidence indicates that Steve Lawson knew that Brooks Houck was going to kill Crystal Rogers and that Steve assisted Houck in trying to get away with it. Lazowski told jurors he knew she was going to be killed, that was the plan. The defense's closing arguments reminded the jury that Steve Lawson did admit to assisting in moving Crystal's car, and therefore he is guilty of evidence tampering, but that is as far as his involvement goes in Crystal's case. He knows nothing about what happened to her. We don't even know that a murder occurred, Darren Wolf told the jury. After a 3-day trial, the jury deliberated for about 3 hours on May the 30th, 2025, before returning a guilty verdict on both charges of conspiracy to commit murder and complicity to tampering with physical evidence for 54-year-old Steve Lawson. They recommended a 17-year sentence. However, formal sentencing is scheduled for August the 6th of 2025. Lawson's attorneys again brought up the fact that the two hairs weren't tested, and those results could have brought a new suspect into play, such as Nick Houck. Special prosecutor Shane Young spoke up, telling the courtroom that Nick Houck and Rosemary Houck are in fact suspects and that Nick is still being investigated. Trial for Brooks Hauk, now 44, and Joseph Lawson, now 34, is currently underway in Bowling Green, Kentucky. More than 50 witnesses are expected to be called, and the trial is expected to last at least 2 weeks, if not longer. Stay tuned for another video covering details of that trial, where we're all hoping that 10 years worth of lip-tight evidence will finally reveal the truth of what happened to Crystal Rogers. There's already been quite a bit of shocking details revealed and lies uncovered. Stay tuned and subscribe so you don't miss it.